I should up my production value and give you guys some like theme music for my intros. Maybe I'll work on that in all this spare time that I have. Anyway, what we're talking about now is Erasmus of Rotterdam. This guy is a inhabitant of what is now the Netherlands, a very free-thinking, forward-thinking place. To this day, obviously, if you've heard of Amsterdam, you know what kind of things, at least you might know what kind of things go on in Amsterdam now. That's historically something that's been fostered there in terms of being able to just tolerate and do things, and this all has to do with what we talked about historically in the context video. When we had the rise of the trade guilds and the Hanseatic League, a lot of these things were being based out of Northern Europe, and particularly the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, because the grip of the Catholic Church was not so tight, they had a little bit more freedom to move about and think as they would. And the same would go for England, because I'm actually talking about two guys. One here from Netherlands and one from England, and then guess what? They were both friends. So, this guy's name is Erasmus. He lives in the city of Rotterdam, which is to the west of Amsterdam. Obviously, the Netherlands isn't a very large country, so we're talking just a matter of miles. And he was a Catholic. He was a devout Catholic, but what was happening, this is also going back to this historical context video. What was happening is, if you recall, that the Pope was trying to finance the Renaissance, at least the art and sculpture and some of the science and architecture of the time. And the big word that comes out of this time that you probably would recognize is the word indulgences. That's when the clergy, the Catholic Church, were selling basically these certificates saying that, we're going to pray extra for your loved one to get them out of purgatory, because that's part of Catholic theology. You'd go to purgatory to burn off sins before you entered heaven. And this was supposed to get your loved ones out of purgatory faster. And these indulgences were financing the Renaissance in Italy. So you had all this sort of manipulation and conniving, very much on the negative, but then again, you was sort of fueling the Renaissance at the same time. So it's bad, but in the long run, it ends up being sort of good. And of course, it's hard to point a finger to the good guy or the bad guy, but that is the outcome. Anyway, so Erasmus is Catholic, and he starts off in his career writing against the abuses of the clergy, which is what I have right here. Boop, boop, boop. There you go. And, of course, Julius Exclusus. This was an invective. It was a nasty piece of literature, sort of an open letter, if you will, a diss track even, against Julius II, who was the Pope. It's called the Warrior Pope, who was riding around Italy and trying to solidify power in the Papal States. And he was also financing people like Michelangelo. He was the one who was having him paint the Sistine Chapel. He was the one who was having the dome built. Both, of course, were built by, both, of course, were from Michelangelo. Michelangelo also did the altarpiece in the front. Another famous Renaissance painter named Botticelli does some of the side pieces. And I know these are all your Ninja Turtle names. Raphael does some things in the Vatican, but not quite there. But it's Julius is the one who's paying for it. It's on his dime. Anyway, this Pope, while he was doing these great and wonderful, magnificent things within central Italy, most of Europe, however, was suffering. And so Erasmus saw that, and he wanted to write this thing against Julius II. And, of course, as you might imagine, it doesn't go over very well. And on free will, that is his book. Of course, he's advocating for free will. And In Praise of Folly is the single most famous work that he has. In fact, I think I have it on my shelf right around there, probably. That's where my philosophy books are. Anyway, welcome to my office, if I haven't already said that for this one. And here we go. Oh, yes, Martin Luther. So now we're starting to get in between some ages. The Renaissance doesn't actually end until later. But we have this period called the Reformation that sort of coincides at the same time with the Reformation. And the Reformation is begun by a chubby monk by the name of Martin Luther. If you remember our talk about Aquinas, where they had to cut out a hole in the table for him to sit down, Martin Luther probably wasn't very far off. And he started reading scriptures, because remember, people are more literate now. People can actually read these things. And he decided, I don't think Catholic theology is correct. And of course, this is sort of spurred on by the Indulgences and the theory of, this theology of purgatory, which was not actually in the Bible. And he starts his Reformation with the 95 Theses nailed to the door of a church there in Germany. And of course, it's just wildfire from there. But Erasmus wants to reform the church from within, not on the outside. So obviously, Martin Luther starts Reformation. You have your various sects, S-E-C-T-S, that form out of that. Lutheranism, named from Martin Luther. He ends up actually getting married and having children. Martin Luther, not a lot of people realize this, but there's a famous hymn called "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." Lots of people, I love that hymn, but it's actually Martin Luther wrote the words, of course in German, and translated into English, but it's actually a beer drinking song from Germany. So there you go. Anyway, let's go ahead and go into the next one. I'm sort of tempted to go to the Slate. Slate.com actually has a Martin Luther insult generator. And I'm tempted to take you just to insult you with the insult generator, but you can do that in your own time. Just Google Martin Luther insult generator. You can get some doozies. Of course, some of them are pretty lame, but for a guy who's leading a religious movement, he said what? And of course, he was actually saying some of those things to Erasmus as well. He would have been the hit of Martin Luther's nastiness. All right, so what else? Well, Erasmus is very much falling into that classical template, the Greeks and the Romans, although he doesn't really have a lot of use for Aristotle, which I do have on here. Right there. He much prefers Plato, but he's also not really thinking too hard about the cosmology or the metaphysics of philosophy. He's going back to that Stoic concept of living a good life. What is the good life? What's an ethical life? And how that can translate into Christianity. And he's emphasizing humanism, humanitas. So he's going forward. He's breaking free from some of these philosophers of the past, trying to do a little bit of his own thing, still within the confines of Christianity. And poor Erasmus, he seems like a very cool guy, but it just doesn't work out very well for him. He ends up being reviled by pretty much all of his contemporaries, except for the English guy Thomas More, may have been his only friend in the world. It's like Patrick and SpongeBob, Erasmus and Thomas More. Okay, so what do we have here? He advocates religious tolerance. This is something that is actually fairly established both in England and in the Netherlands by now, and it's going to go even more later on when we talk about Voltaire in a while. Voltaire, who lived in the 18th century, he's a Frenchman, and he's very much against the French institutions of this day. And he goes to England and he just marvels at how free-thinking and open and tolerant people are in England. For those of you who say, but what about the Puritans? They kicked out the Puritans. I'm like, well, yes, but that's because the Puritans were, how shall we say, they were especially belligerent towards their countrymen. They actually end up having to go to the Netherlands for a while before heading back to England. And of course, Plymouth Rock is 400 years ago, almost exactly, actually, 1620 is when the Puritans landed in America. Anyway, I'm sure you all really wanted to know that. We're actually, in terms of time period, not too far off from that yet. But he is advocating religious tolerance, and in his work In Praise of Folly, he personifies folly, and he's talking about all the abuses of the church. He's going for a lot of the issues of the day, the contemporary issues of the day. And he is writing a little bit about paradoxes, which we talked about with Cleanthes, Chrysippus, Zeno, the Greek Stoics. And then, of course, he's attacking European and Catholic traditions and superstitions. And he says, guys, enough's enough. If you sneeze and you say bless you, you're not just scaring demons away, okay? That's ridiculous. If you're avoiding the number 13, that's also stupid. Go away. Get over yourselves. So he's telling people to like wise up, which coming out of what was the Middle Ages is it needed to be said, and he's one of the people who does say it. And of course, I already said in the last bullet there, he's not very well received by his contemporaries, except for this guy, who is the last guy we'll talk about for this little bit of the presentation. This is Thomas More. Like I said, he's buddies with Erasmus. He lives in England, and he has a work called Utopia. It's his most famous work that exists still. He talks about this island in the South Atlantic, perhaps not too far from where Napoleon would have died. I don't know. Obviously, we're talking about a time of the Age of Discovery. All these things are concurrent, happening at the same time. You have this Age of Discovery with Columbus. You have the Renaissance happening, and you have the Reformation sort of all happening at the very same time. And the world is changing very quickly. So, what does he say about Utopia? He says that everyone has a job, no one goes hungry, and everyone works. And those who work are obviously taken care of by those who can. He also says there's no such thing as property, so this is not my office that you're seeing in the background. This would be like the state office. These are state books and state David Bowie painting. All that stuff is owned by the entity of everyone that they refer to as the state, which sounds an awful lot like communism, which of course it sort of is. This is the predecessor to what would become known as communism. And interestingly enough, where did Karl Marx spend the biggest chunk of his life? He lived in London, England, because he was forced out of Germany, and this is sort of where he had to stay because people were more accepting and let him do what he wanted to do and write what he wanted to write. And it's no wonder that he would have studied someone like Thomas More and others to come up with his own ideas as well. So, obviously, emphasis on communist living, and that's it. So it's going to wrap up the Thomas More Erasmus talk. If you have any questions, obviously drop them to me. We will see you in a moment when we talk about Machiavelli.